Adobe has added so many AI tools to Lightroom Classic and Photoshop even just over the last year, which can make it hard to choose which would be best at what part of the workflow. So what I'm going to do in this episode is I'm going to break down the latest AI tools that are available right now in Lightroom Classic and Photoshop, why they work better at certain parts of the workflow and under certain circumstances. I'm also going to show why they don't exist sometimes between these two different programs, and then also what I recommend for real estate photography. So we'll start off in Lightroom Classic with this photo, which actually started out as this original raw file here. And you can see that it is very, very overexposed, but by using some simple AI in Lightroom Classic, then we got this with basically just a click of a button, but a few other things that I'm going to show using other AI tools in this video. Now, the first thing that we did here to get this into a state that it was workable is an AI feature that's really only available in Lightroom Classic and Camera Raw, not Camera Raw Filter. I'll show why in just a second, but it's known as an adaptive profile, not an adaptive preset. I'm also going to touch on that shortly. But what we have up here when you first load it in, you'll see up here the profile is by default, usually Adobe Color, unless you've set your default to something different. And I've shown that in earlier videos. You might have seen that. Well, all you have to do here is to really finesse something like this, and this works very well if an image is overexposed, is to go here and use adaptive color. When you do, this is where AI will then decode the raw file into this form. Now, if you notice, none of the sliders were moved. Instead, this was just part of the decoding process. That's something, once again, I'll get into in a second, but I wanted to show what would happen if you tried to open this into Photoshop. In Photoshop, if you went to File, Open, then you could navigate to where that raw file is, and once you select it, if it is a raw file, when you say to open it, it'll first open it in Adobe Camera Raw. Now, this is not Camera Raw Filter, this is Adobe Camera Raw. And the same thing is available here, where instead of Adobe Color, I could say use an adaptive profile. It's going to give me a little bit of a different prompt here, but basically you can see the results are the same, and then I could go on to open it into Photoshop. But if this was opened into Photoshop from Lightroom Classic, we'd be faced with something different. For instance, if we go back before applying this adaptive profile, and if I were to right-click on this, and I said to Edit In, and then Edit in Photoshop 2025, what it's going to do is it's going to open this as a TIFF into Photoshop. That's how it transfers these files back and forth. So at this point, if I went up to Camera Raw Filter, which is under Filter, Camera Raw Filter, then we don't have those options under the profiles because it's a TIFF file at this point. It's no longer a raw file. And the reason this AI feature isn't available in Photoshop at this stage is because of this three-step process. So before editing a raw file, it needs to be decoded, also known as the debayering process. This turns the raw file into something we can visualize, and then during that decoding step, we can select treatment files to tell Lightroom Classic or Adobe Camera Raw how to decode the raw file when applying an adaptive profile. Now, AI is used during that decoding process then, using the adaptive profile, to decode the raw file to what it deems best. But once we go to the editing step, like opening the raw file into Photoshop from Lightroom Classic, then the file isn't a raw file any longer, it's being transferred to Photoshop as a TIFF file, not raw. So adaptive profiles, they don't work well for interiors, but they can help with exterior raw files. You'll see once again that none of the sliders were adjusted. This is just during that decoding process. That allows us now to make other adjustments, including another AI feature in Lightroom Classic that can take this to the next level. The next AI feature that can be used in both Lightroom Classic and Photoshop can take this image to the next level, and that's using landscape masking. You may have seen me do this also in earlier videos, where what you can do is go to your masking options here, and one of them is called landscape. When you select that, AI goes out and detects all of the landscape features. Once again, this is really for exterior photos. Once it has detected the various landscape features, then it'll show all the various ones here. Sometimes you'll also see water and whatnot, whatever it detected as being an architectural feature. What I'm going to do is I can select all these and it's going to create an individual mask for each that I can adjust separately. So here I'll just create those 5 separate masks. Then I can take, for instance, the sky, and I know the sky, typically when doing this, it tends to put a little bit more green tint into it, so I'm just going to increase the red tint just a little bit on the sky. Then I can go to, for instance, the architecture, which is the house, and then I can decide to increase the exposure a little bit. Now you can see by doing that there's a little bit of stuff that got left over here, so since it's a mask, I can then subtract that. So I can subtract it with a brush and then just remove those areas that it was just not really picking up correctly. It thought it was architecture. But whatever I wanted to do to the architecture mask, to this part, which is really the house, then I can say, you know what, I want to also increase maybe some of the shadows, whatever it is I want to brighten it up to. Then I can take, for instance, the vegetation, and maybe with the vegetation, I'll increase the saturation just a tad. Going further, we'll go to the artificial ground, which is down here, and then I can say, let's take out the highlights of that so it's just not so bright. Also in this case, artificial ground usually isn't a big feature. I don't want a lot of clarity in it. So a little trick that I do sometimes is I'll drop the clarity down here, which makes it just a little softer. So I've got that now going on. But one thing you may hear in the background is that my fans are spinning. And that's because I've used 2 process-intensive AI features in Lightroom Classic between the adaptive profile and also all this landscape masking. So this is chewing up a lot of CPU resources, and if you don't have a very fast machine, these features might not work the best. So far we've got something that looks a lot better with all of that masking then applied to it. And once again, this is using just a single raw file that originally looked like this when we imported it in. We added the adaptive profile and then the landscape masking. All AI tools that work great in Lightroom Classic, we've got this. This is a lot harder to use in Photoshop because Photoshop, under its select menu, doesn't have anything for selecting landscape. You'd have to use camera raw filter, so you can do that, but sometimes this is just best just to stay in Lightroom Classic to edit something very quickly. Once again, this works well on exteriors, doesn't work well on interiors, and it can be very CPU intensive. But at this phase, there's another AI feature that we can use to take advantage of what we've done so far. The next step is to take everything we've done and say, we like this when we're doing exteriors that are overexposed. Let's now save this as an adaptive preset. And really, that's just a fancy way of saying we're going to make a preset with these AI features. And it's just like making any other preset. You would go over here to presets and you would add a new preset. And I can then create that preset and I can add anything that I like, but there's a trick here. And that's that under this subset down here. And this is only in newer versions of Lightroom Classic. Instead of default, choose modified. This then shows the things that were done to this particular raw file that are unique. So here we did the treatment profile, which was our adaptive profile. I had some lens corrections done earlier here, typically that you would do when you first even bring something imported. And then you can see the masking that I did here for sky, architecture, vegetation, and the different ground masks. Once I have that, then I can decide where I want to put that. Say Nathan's AI presets. Probably makes more sense there. And then we'll just call this, just for here, our test demo. Once I then save that preset, then I can apply this to other images. For instance, let's take a look at this exterior shot. Completely different house, but once again, it's overexposed. Now, these images were overexposed because they were part of a bracket that I shot. I don't go out and just shoot overexposed images. And this would be used typically to fill in the darkened, shadowy areas that I have that I do exposure blending with. But in this case, you can see that with this overexposed image, back on topic here for what we want to do, I can apply our exterior preset to it. In this case, I called it Test Demo. So if I apply Test Demo to this image, then it's going to take a little while because it has to do its AI work once again to go out and find all the landscape masking and also do that adaptive profile. But once it's done, just by applying this one click on this one preset, then I have this feature here. Now, I still might want to do something different here. This is obviously too overexposed, but what I can do then is go to my masking. I already have then a mask that's made for my architecture. So with that, instead of having the exposure up, I can just bring that exposure back down. But I've got this preset then that was applied, already did the adaptive profile to it and all the landscape masking that I can then reuse. And this is different from Photoshop, where a mask's geometry can be copy and pasted. But in Lightroom Classic, the AI masks, like the landscape masking, even if you were to use sky detection, etc., it saves the instruction to use AI to detect the features, so it automatically adapts to each image that the preset is applied to. But at this point, we're really scratching the surface. The next ones that I want to show are used more often in the real estate photography workflow. But before getting to that, I just wanted to mention real quick that if you did want to learn more about learning real estate photography, then I'd invite you to take a look at my courses on real estate photography. I have online courses that teach professional interiors, expert editing, exteriors, videography, business and marketing, and also I have a series of books on real estate photography, and I have a link to all of that down in the description of this video. Now let's look at one of the more popular AI techniques, and that's object removal, using this image to remove the sign in the front yard over here, and then also these mattresses that were left in the driveway. They were put out there hoping that the trash was going to be picked up before I got there. Well, they still weren't there, but I'm not worried about that stuff anymore. These are very easy to remove, whether you're using Lightroom Classic or Photoshop. So first, let's remove these in Lightroom Classic. And to do that, you would use the Remove tool. And over here, it's best to use generative AI. It's going to give you a better example and also detect objects. Nowadays, they don't charge you generative credits. They used to charge a generative credit every time you used something that you said generative AI on it. Nowadays, that just isn't true. So this isn't the same way with the Remove tool in Photoshop. They're not going to use generative credits. You will, though, be using generative credits if you use, for instance, the generative AI fill. And that, by the way, is covered with a lot of other options in another video that I have. And I've got a link to that video down in the description of this video as well. But to use this, you would basically select your size of the brush, and you can do that also with your keys or whatnot. I'm going to just draw around this sign here. Now I'm not going to get the shadow because what we're going to do is limit ourselves to about 2000 pixels. This is something also covered in that earlier video. So you want to sometimes have this within a decent range where it's not going to be too big. You don't have to remove too much at once. You can do it in pieces and get a better quality photo. Once you have that selected, though, you just click Remove. And it goes out and it does its AI thing, and it did a pretty good job removing that out of there. Same thing I can do then we'll go back to the Remove tool and we'll do those mattresses real quick, and I'll just draw something around those mattresses like so. Let it do its remove thing here, and when that is done, it removed the entire fence. But if you use this tool in Lightroom Classic compared to the Remove tool in Photoshop, even though you're not paying for generative credits, you still have variations. Here's the variation 1, here's variation 2, and here's variation 3. Now, all of them did take out the fence, but I could probably add that in. But it is a little bit touch and go using this. If I got in a lot closer, I could probably refine it even better. And of course, I'd still want to remove this shadow down here. That's no biggie. But let's take a look at this over in Photoshop. Using the Remove tool here, I've got a little bit more flexibility. So I can decide if, just like we did before, if I'm going to use generative AI or not. We'll use it this time. I can also then create a new layer so I can do something else with it and keep it separate from other edits. So doing that, I'll once again just draw something around this sign. And once again, we're not going to get the shadow. That way we've got something that'll be higher resolution. And then I just let it do its remove thing. I've also found this to be just a little less process intensive on the CPU than using it in Lightroom Classic. And it could be because it only gives you this one option, which is what it removed here, which is this layer. It completely removed that sign. Now, each time, if I keep this Create New Layer selected, it'll keep creating a new layer on all the things I want to remove. So I could do this here like that, And if I get in closer here then to these mattresses that are laying on the ground, I can probably now draw a more refined outline, and I could have gotten in closer in Lightroom Classic as well. But drawing that outline that turns purple says, yes, you've selected everything, and then I'll click the checkbox to remove it. And once again, it's going to create now a new layer. And you can see that by getting closer, I was able to get something that definitely did a more accurate remove. Now, I don't have the 3 various options that I did in Lightroom Classic using the remove tool, but in either case, it didn't cost me any generative credits. Now, I actually prefer to use all the removes here. I'm usually blending photos anyways. I'm rarely staying in just Lightroom Classic. You've probably seen through the various workflows that I show that I don't like to just stay in Lightroom Classic. Sometimes it can be fast, but a lot of those things that we've covered so far were very CPU intensive, and they just aren't as CPU intensive over here in Photoshop. Also at this point, there's a lot of other tools I could use in Photoshop that are just easier, like cloning or whatnot. But backing out of this, if I didn't use any of these and I did decide to use generative fill, then that's going to give me 3 options, but it's going to ding me a generative credit. So for instance, if I wanted to remove these mattresses, I could take a polygon tool and I could draw a polygon around these mattresses by going up to Edit and then Generative Fill, and then here either leaving it blank or saying remove items like that, saying generate. This will then give me 3 different options to choose from. And yes, this is more flexible and I've got a lot of control because I'm using any selection tool I want. For instance, in this case, it was the polygon tool, but sometimes it doesn't do the greatest job. And you can see here, if we zoom in, it really didn't do that great of a job and it just cost me a generative credit. This one also isn't as good. This one isn't as good. I got better results just using the remove tool. Look at this, very, very accurate, and it didn't cost me any generative credits. The next AI feature is doing sky swaps. And unfortunately, this isn't something you can just do in Lightroom Classic. Now, we could do the landscape detection, or we could even detect the sky with our masks. But if you're going to be using sky swaps, it's probably best to do this in Photoshop. And you would just merely right-click on the image, and then you would say Edit In, and then Edit in Photoshop. Now, there are a number of ways to do this, to put in a sky here, and I show a variety of them in my exterior course. And that's because before AI, we were able to detect colors, we put in skies, we were doing sky swaps before AI, and sometimes it does work better. Sometimes also it's best to just detect the sky here and then make a mask on another layer that has a sky. But one easy way to do this is just to use the sky replacement feature. So if you go to the Edit menu, there is a sky replacement feature. And in here, you can select different skies. Now, this is one that I loaded and it saved it. And you can see it automatically put it in. You can choose those different ones by going here, and then you can add different ones. I could say, let's just delete this one. I don't like it. But this was a raw file I took some time ago, and I use it for a lot of my skies that need sky swaps because it's got a lot of clouds in it, making it look more natural. But in here too, then, I can decide to move it. Using this tool here, I can move this back and forth however I want, wherever I see fit. I can also then change some of the edges on it. I can change the brightness of it here without having to add another adjustment layer to it. And I can also output this to a new layer, and then I can just say OK. And now I've got these various layers here. Now, the one thing that you will see is that if I were to take a look at just this mask, by doing an Alt-click on the sky mask, you can see that it's actually overlapping here onto the house. And these are things that I show how to correct also in the exteriors course. It gets a little bit more complicated where you actually want to change some of the levels on some of the masks. But it's an okay feature. Sometimes it's not quite as noticeable. Like here, it's not as noticeable. Some cases, though, you'll actually notice blue on the houses. For instance, if I turn this on and off, you can actually see, if we zoom in here especially, that there's a little bit of blue that's on the house. So that's right there. But either way, you're kind of stuck. If you want to do sky swaps, you're going to have to do them in Photoshop and then deal with this. You can also take this group and just erase some of this stuff out of there. There's a lot of ways to deal with it. But if you want to do sky swaps, you're going to have to do that in Photoshop. The next feature I'd like to talk about is getting rid of noise, because this particular drone shot here, it wasn't this bright, you can see that I've upped it by 4 stops. Originally, it was this dark. Now, once again, this is just out of a bracket. We don't shoot photos this dark, but I just wanted to show what would happen if you did have something that had a lot of noise. This is something that's really low priority for real estate photography because we're in a lot more control of what we're shooting. We don't usually shoot photos at very high ISOs to have to worry about this. And most cameras, even at high ISOs, they don't really get much noise. Something I've talked about before in other videos. And if you want to see more videos on any of these subjects not covered in here, just leave me a comment below. But let's zoom in here real close and let's take a look. And you can see that there's grain here. There's a fair amount of noise when we look around here at the sky, these mountains in the distance, and even these fields. So we have a feature here in Lightroom Classic that because this is a RAW file and it's just during the debayering process right now, we can apply denoise, which takes AI and then does some denoising based off of AI, once again, during that debayering process. That's why you don't find this natively in Photoshop, but I'm going to show you some alternatives in Photoshop without having to use this. And you'll hear my fans, they kicked on because this was very CPU intensive. A lot of work had to be done on this image. So that took out a lot of that noise, and it looks pretty good. I can also adjust the noise further. That's just at 50. I could take this denoising all the way up to 100 so it has the maximum amount of denoise into it. If I were to turn this on and off, for instance, say this is without the denoise, it looks grainy, a little bit grainy. It's not completely terrible. But when I turn this back on, it does get more smooth. If you look over here, especially in these hills right here, that's with the denoise. If I turn that off, you can see that's before the denoise. It actually just looks a lot cleaner overall. So at this point, show you a little extra here. If I were to do this in Photoshop, and I had this even if it was properly exposed and I didn't have to do denoise, to bring in that sky, I wouldn't be using a sky swap or anything else. I'd use the old linear gradient tool. And what I'd do is I'd put a mask here of a linear gradient, over the sky blending into the ground. And then so it gets a lot of that haze. And then from here, I might decrease the exposure just a tad. But the biggest thing is here then I would use dehaze. And then I would increase the dehaze amount on this image so that that starts coming through. Once I have that done, and of course I didn't use an adaptive profile, these are older tools except for the denoise, and then from here I would just make a few other simple adjustments to maybe bring down the highlights, up the shadows, add some contrast, also between the whites and blacks and clarity, and then I might just add a little bit overall saturation. So we've got this image now that when we zoom in, we can see that it's pretty clean, even though it was really terribly underexposed, and that's because we did this denoise feature before we made all these other adjustments. And once again, you're hearing my fans go off because of that AI denoise. So let's try this over in Photoshop. Let me just back out of here before we did anything to it. Let's just now increase that exposure by 4 stops. I'll just go over here and say let's increase by 4 full stops. And then I'll right click and edit in Photoshop. So without using AI in Photoshop to get similar results, what I'm going to do then is just duplicate this layer by doing Control J. Let's zoom in here 100%. We'll take a look at those areas that had some noise in them, especially here in the hills and there in the sky. What I can do now is go to Filter and down to Noise and Reduce Noise. This brings up a dialog with a variety of choices. How much I want to denoise, and I'm going to put it all the way up at a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, and also reduce all the color noise that's in there. I can choose to have the sharpen details on, which might introduce a little bit extra noise. You can play around with that. Preserve details too. If you bring that down, that will then usually then soften that up a little bit more. So between these, I get a little bit more control over how much I want to denoise compared to how much detail that I want to have in the image. If that looks okay, all that I have to do is just say okay. And now I can compare the two by turning one layer off. There's our noisy one that got it brought over into Photoshop, and here's our denoised one. Then at this point, we could do other edits similar to like what I just did over in Lightroom Classic. But given all that I was able to do here in this case, especially since it's just a drone photo and I can make these adjustments in Lightroom Classic, I would do it all in Lightroom Classic and not go back and forth. There's really no necessary case here to do some sky swapping. I can work with the sky just well enough by dehazing some of it, using that linear gradient that I did, and I get the advantage of using denoise. And even if I didn't denoise, most of the time when editing drone photos, this is the process that I use in Lightroom Classic. When I'm doing houses though, that's a little bit different. It's very, very AI intensive if you use only Lightroom Classic to edit your exteriors. So sometimes it's best just to use exposure blending. It doesn't use as much AI. And if you're hearing once again, my fans are starting to spin up because of all the AI that was done just to this one photo. Think about if you're editing then about 10 different exteriors plus other interiors, all the AI that you've got going on, then you've got some CPU intensive stuff during your editing process. But between all these various features, try them all out and you'll see what fits best with your workflow, the type of shots that you're taking, and the type of computer that you have and how much CPU power and the results that you get. You can then make an informed decision how you want to use these to your advantage.